home yesterday. It was like a ghost town. Like, she wasn't here. Kids weren't here. I have no idea like where they went.
At 5:15 in the morning, a husband left his home for work. By the end of the day, his wife and 2 daughters would be reported missing. And within 48 hours, the search for a missing family would become a murder investigation. But what made this case different was not only what investigators discovered. It was who was standing in front of the cameras. The person asking America for help. The person telling neighbors he wanted his family back. The person appearing desperate for answers was the same person investigators would eventually accuse of knowing exactly what happened. On August 13th, 2018, the Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado became the center of a national investigation. Inside that house was a story that appeared simple. A pregnant mother was missing. 2 young children were missing. The husband was searching for answers, but detectives quickly noticed something. The story being told did not completely match the evidence they were finding. A neighbor's camera captured something unusual. A timeline raised questions. Statements changed, and investigators began looking beyond the disappearance itself. Because sometimes the hardest cases to solve are not the ones where nobody knows anything. They're the ones where someone appears to know exactly what happened. But the truth is hidden behind a carefully constructed story. Chris Watts was not initially investigated as a suspect. He was the husband asking the world to help find his family. But over the next few days, detectives would uncover a series of details that would transform the investigation forever. What happened inside the Watts family home? Why did investigators begin questioning the person closest to the missing family? And how did a case that started as a search for answers become one of the most followed criminal investigations in America? This is the investigation into Chris Watts. Before investigators, before detectives, and before the cameras arrived outside their home, the Watts family was simply a family. They lived in Frederick, Colorado, a growing suburban community where neighbors knew each other, children played outside, and life appeared predictable. Chris and Shanann Watts built a life that looked familiar to many families across America. A marriage, a home, 2 young daughters, and another child on the way. From the outside, their story appeared to be one of progress. A young couple building a future together. But the image people saw was shaped heavily by what was shared publicly. Shanann was active on social media. She regularly shared moments from her life. Family celebrations, her children's milestones, daily routines, and memories with the people closest to her. To friends, relatives, and people who followed her online, the Watts family appeared connected. They appeared happy. They appeared to be moving forward. But behind every public image is a private reality. And investigators would later examine the parts of the story that were not visible to the outside world. Chris Watts and Shanann's relationship had not always been simple. Like many marriages, it had experienced challenges, financial pressures, personal disagreements, and changes that affected the direction of their lives. By the summer of 2018, their relationship was entering a difficult period. Shanann was away on a business trip when she and Chris communicated regularly. She returned to Colorado shortly before everything changed. At the same time, investigators would later discover that Chris had begun a relationship outside his marriage. That discovery would become an important part of the investigation into what happened next. But at this point, nobody around the Watts family knew what was coming. To neighbors, friends, and people who knew them, the family appeared to be preparing for another chapter of their lives. A new baby was expected, and the future appeared ordinary. Until one morning in August. On the night of August 12th, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home after traveling for work. Hours later, the Watts family home would become the center of a missing persons investigation. The next morning, the normal routine of a suburban household would be replaced by unanswered questions. Where was Shanann? Where were Bella and Celeste? And why was the person searching for them beginning to draw the attention of investigators? On the morning of August 13th, 2018, the Watts family home appeared quiet. From the outside, it looked like any other house in the neighborhood. A driveway, a garage, a family home. But inside, something had changed. Shanann Watts had returned from a business trip only hours earlier. She had plans for the day. Her children had a normal routine ahead of them. But as the morning continued, people close to Shanann began noticing something unusual. She was not responding. For someone who regularly communicated with friends and family, the silence was concerning. One person became especially worried. Her friend, who had plans to meet with her that day, could not reach her. After repeated attempts to contact Shanann, concern grew. A decision was made that would begin one of the most closely followed investigations in modern American true crime. A welfare check was requested. When officers arrived at the Watts residence, they were not responding to a confirmed crime. They were responding to a missing person concern. At that moment, the investigation was still about finding answers. Where was Shanann? Where were the children? Was there an explanation? But as officers entered the home, they began collecting the first details that would shape the investigation. The house did not immediately provide the answers everyone was looking for. Instead, investigators were left with questions. The family was missing, but there were no obvious signs explaining why. In any missing person investigation, the first hours are critical. Detectives must establish a timeline. They need to understand who was last seen, who had contact with the missing person, what happened before they disappeared. Every detail matters. A phone call, a message, a camera recording, a conversation. And one of the first people investigators needed to speak with was the last known person to see the family, Chris Watts. When Chris arrived at the scene, he told investigators that he did not know where his wife and children were. He described leaving for work that morning and returning later to discover his family was gone. Soon after, Chris made a public appeal. He spoke with reporters outside his home. He asked for help finding his wife and children. To many watching, he appeared to be a husband searching for answers. But investigators were trained to look beyond appearances. They were not trying to determine whether someone looked concerned. They were trying to determine whether the facts matched the story. And one of the first people to notice something unusual was not a detective. It was a neighbor. Across the street from the Watts home, a neighbor had security cameras. Those cameras would later become an important part of the investigation. The footage showed activity around the home during the early morning hours. And investigators began examining what happened before Chris left for work. For detectives, the footage raised important questions. Why did Chris appear to move his vehicle in the way he did? Why was he acting differently from what investigators expected? The footage did not solve the case by itself, but it added another piece to a growing puzzle. And in investigations, a single piece of evidence rarely tells the whole story. The truth is often found by connecting many small details. At this stage, investigators still did not have all the answers, but they had something every investigation begins with: a timeline. They now had to reconstruct the final hours before the Watts family disappeared. Who was where? Who communicated with whom? And what happened inside the home before Chris Watts left that morning? Because the biggest question was no longer only, where's the family? It was becoming, was the story investigators were hearing the complete truth? As news spread through Frederick, Colorado, the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her two daughters quickly became a community-wide concern. Neighbors who had known the family searched for answers. Friends waited for updates. And investigators began the difficult task of reconstructing the final known moments before the family disappeared. At first, the case appeared to be a missing persons investigation. But missing person cases are rarely solved by one discovery. They're solved by building a timeline. Who was the last person to see them? Who had contact with them? What was happening in their lives before they disappeared? And for detectives, One of the most important sources of information was the person closest to the missing family, Chris Watts. As the search continued, Chris Watts spoke publicly about his missing family. He appeared before cameras asking for help. He described his hope that Shanann and the children would return. To viewers watching from across the country, it appeared to be the emotional response of a husband and father desperate for answers. But investigators were not judging the situation based on appearances. Their role was different. They had to examine every possibility, every statement, every timeline, every piece of evidence. Because in an investigation, the first version of events is not always the final version of events. Detectives began putting together a timeline of the hours surrounding the disappearance. They examined communication records, surveillance footage, witness statements, and activity connected to the Watts home. The goal was simple: the movements around the home, the information provided by witnesses, and Chris Watts' own statements. A criminal investigation is often built this way, not from one single discovery, but from many details that create a larger picture. And as detectives continued examining the case, the distance between the evidence and Chris's explanation began to grow. During the interview process, detectives eventually changed their approach. They moved from gathering information to applying pressure. They knew that a complete explanation was still missing, and they gave Chris an opportunity to provide another account of what happened. This moment became one of the most significant turning points in the entire investigation. After speaking with detectives, Chris Watts began changing his explanation of events. The story he had previously presented was no longer the only version being considered, and investigators were now moving closer to the truth. Chris Watts eventually admitted responsibility for the deaths of his wife and daughters. The investigation that had begun as a missing persons case had now become a criminal investigation. The question was no longer, where did the family go? Investigators now had to answer, what happened, and how could the evidence prove it? A confession does not end a criminal investigation. Investigators must still verify information. They must collect evidence. They must reconstruct events. They must build a case that can withstand legal examination. The confession became one part of a much larger investigation. Detectives now had to connect the timeline, the evidence, and the events that led to the disappearance of the Watts family. A confession can change the direction of an investigation, but it does not replace the investigation itself. After Chris Watts admitted responsibility, detectives still had a critical task ahead. They needed to reconstruct what happened. They needed evidence. Because in a criminal case, the question is not only, what did someone say? The question is, does the evidence support what happened? Investigators began piecing together the final known movements of the Watts family. They examined communication records, witness statements, surveillance footage, and information connected to Chris Watts' activities before and after the disappearance. Every investigation relies on timelines. A timeline helps answer basic but important questions. Where was each person? When did events happen? Who had contact with whom? In the Watts investigation, creating that timeline became essential to understanding the sequence of events. Modern investigations often rely heavily on digital evidence. Phones, messages, and online activity can provide investigators with information about communication patterns and relationships. In this case, investigators examined digital information connected to Chris Watts and the people around him. This included communication records and details about his personal life before the disappearance. Digital evidence does not tell a complete story by itself, but combined with witness accounts and physical evidence, it can help investigators understand what happened. One of the early pieces of information investigators examined came from a neighbor's security camera. The footage became significant because it provided a record of activity around the Watts home during the morning of August 13th. For investigators, surveillance footage is valuable because it creates an independent record. It does not rely on memory. It does not rely only on statements. It captures moments that can later be compared with other evidence. And in this investigation, those comparisons became important. Investigators also examined Chris Watts' workplace activities. The location where he worked became part of the investigation because it was connected to the timeline they were building. Family members and loved ones had the opportunity to speak about the lives that were lost and the impact the events had on them. The courtroom became the final public stage of case that had already captured worldwide attention. The judge sentenced Chris Watts to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence formally ended the criminal proceedings, but the questions surrounding the case continued to draw attention, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the investigation that followed. The Chris Watts case became one of the most discussed criminal investigations of the modern era. Part of that attention came from the contrast between the public image of the family and the investigation that followed. A suburban home, a family appearing ordinary, a husband publicly asking for help, and then a rapid shift as investigators uncovered a very different reality. The case became a reminder that investigations are not built on appearances. They're built on evidence. The Watts investigation demonstrated how modern criminal investigations combine different sources of information. Witness interviews, surveillance footage, digital evidence, recorded conversations. No single piece of information solved the case alone. Instead, investigators connected separate pieces until they formed a complete picture. That process is the foundation of criminal investigation. Even after the legal process ended, many people continued asking questions about the case. How can someone appear to live one life while hiding another? How do investigators recognize when a story does not match the evidence? And how does a community recover after a case that changed the way people viewed their own neighborhoods? The answers are not always simple, but one thing remains clear. Behind every investigation are real people, real families, and consequences that continue long after a courtroom closes. The Chris Watts investigation was not only a story about a crime. It was a story about perception, evidence, and the process of searching for the truth. At the beginning, the world saw a family searching for answers. By the end, investigators had uncovered a case that would become one of the most recognized criminal investigations in recent history. The evidence told a story. The courtroom delivered a judgment, and the lives affected by this case would never be the same. This was the investigation into Chris Watts. Every case begins with questions. Who was involved? What happened? And how did investigators uncover the truth? But some investigations leave behind questions that continue long after the verdict. If you followed this investigation, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next episode of Unhinged Cases. In the next episode, we examine another case where evidence, human behavior, and the justice system collide. The investigation continues.